Welcome, everyone. My name is Josh Human. I'm the head of artistic engagement here at Koffler Arts. You are in our newest space, Koffler 301. I'll say it was an office space by very good fortune. I'll say due to some unforeseen debt from a certain organization, it opened up the opportunity for Koffler Arts to make this acquisition, newly renovated and just opened in late October with this exhibition by Dmitry Levinov, curated by David Liss, whose name I will repeat a little bit in just a minute or two. The reason for this gathering, so for starters, thank you so much for being here. I see young and mature folks in the crowd, is to hear about something of punk in Toronto, and was inspired by the exhibition that we have downstairs by Tracey Snelling called INTERGALACTIC PLANETARY, which will remain open after this discussion. So if you haven't already seen that exhibition after this discussion, please head on down, take a look at that exhibition. Tracey Snelling, an American artist from Oakland, California, who's been living in Berlin for the last 9 or 10 years, definitely embraces, we'll say, think of like Beastie Boys, all the way back to punk, as aesthetic inspiration in some way, shape, or form, as she grapples with some of the realities of what it means to live in an urbanized, overbuilt space where, you know, we can be, we'll say, voyeuristic and or subjects, you know, or exhibitionistic, I guess, but really grappling with what that means in our daily lives, living in this sort of urban environment. And so, of course, we thought, well, if Tracey is particularly inspired by, you know, punk and what came after, maybe we should take this opportunity to look at what's going on, what was going on during that period here in Toronto. And in conversation with David Liss, who joins us as moderator for this conversation, David said, you know, I can't recollect another panel discussion or conversation that really explored this topic in Toronto. If any of you know of such a conversation that has happened in the past, please do let us know. But we are super excited, of course, for David to be in conversation with 3 esteemed panelists, Gary Topp, Liz Worth, and Ian Mackay. And I presume, I don't know if you're going to introduce them or have them introduce themselves.
Well, I thought you were. I don't have a list of
Oh my gosh.
what's going on here.
Well, so perhaps we'll ask
but
each of
everybody
them.
here knows who they are.
Exactly. So, without further ado, I'll just pass things over to David and our panelists. Please welcome them.
Well, thanks, Josh. Also, I don't know if you noticed, we don't have any microphones. Of course, nobody, particularly my family, have any problem usually hearing me. But we'll try and, I guess if there's any audience participation, we're going to ask people to speak up, although this is it is being recorded. It's great that those people have sound. But in any case, thanks everyone for being here for this discussion. As Josh said, it's kind of inspired by the exhibition downstairs, which is exploring subcultures. And I guess the Koffler thought it was a good idea to explore, I think, what was an important subculture in this city, in Toronto, punk music. And so we have, so they've invited some great panelists here. We have Ian Mackay from the band The Diodes, Liz Worth, who has the famous book Treat Me Like Dirt, that talks about the Toronto punk scene from 77 to 81. Is that the subtitle? And Gary Topp, who was a film and music promoter, predating punk all through that era, and punk within the context of, let's say, other subcultures, that we're going to talk about that too. I just want to say, and some people, of course, I realize that it's an important area, and some people identify with it quite strongly. And well, these panelists here are quite well known to this punk community. A couple of people are asking me, so what are you doing there, pal? I just want to say that, given my age, I grew up in Hamilton, Ontario, in the West End, with my good friends from childhood, Teenage Head. So I was around at the beginning of that band and the Forgotten Rebels in Hamilton. I saw many of the shows, punk and, let's say, alternative music shows. Many of the ones that Gary put on back in the day. And I also traveled a lot and was at some of the first punk shows at 341 Powell in Vancouver, the Smiling Buddha, Mulberry Gardens in San Francisco, and then for I think in 1981 maybe with Stuart Pollock, the first manager of Teenage Head. We started presenting shows in a dive bar in Hamilton, and so my point there is that I was there, and I'm semi-legit to be talking about this topic. I think punk. It's a four-letter word, but I think within that, it's a pretty rich subculture. It certainly was in Toronto. Toronto was one of the first cities to have, let's say, a punk rock scene. But maybe just to get things, to clarify things to start, Liz, how would you define punk? What is this punk?
Oh, I mean, it depends on the era that you're talking about. For me, punk, I always gravitated to first wave punk. So even though I was born after the fact, when I was a teenager discovering music, bands like The Clash and the Ramones and the Damned were really important to me. And through researching that history, I found that punk was a lot more than I think people of my generation were putting together. For some people, again, it depends on the era that you're looking at, but it's really easy to just look at current bands and think that a scene begins and ends with the present moment. But when I started looking back into punk history, for me, punk became so much more than music and fashion. Of course, those are two things that are really important in it. But for me, punk has always been about freedom of expression and creativity and innovation in all genres, all mediums. So it's also poetry, it's photography, it's art, it's performance, it's many layers of things. And I've always looked at it as a place where if people want it to be that, then it's a way for you to become anything that you want to be.
So it's pretty open like that?
That's how I have always seen it. Yeah, I see it less as something, of course it's very pigeonholed, but I've always seen it as something a lot broader than that.
Well, I've heard some people refer to 1976 as the year zero of punk. And I know when the Head started out in I think 1975 in their bass player Steve Mann's driveway, I don't think they were necessarily thinking about punk or even necessarily aware of it. But when the Diodes came along, what year did the Diodes start? Was that
76.
76. Yeah. So when you started the Diodes, did you consciously want to start a punk rock band?
Just backing up a little bit from there, I think the OCA experience, Ontario College of Art, plays a pretty big factor in the development of a lot of bands that came out of that period. It was really kind of started with what some people call the Thornhill Sound, a band called Oh Those Pants, which was a 12-piece band, used to play the Beaux-Arts Ball at the Ontario College of Art. And they had 2 lead singers, 2 drummers, 5 guitarists. I mean, they were like broken social scene back then. And it was hilarious because they adopted all kinds of costumes. They played the role of the rock star as kind of parody deliberately. And simultaneous with that, there was another band was playing the Beverly, the Dishes. Many of you have probably heard of the dishes associated with General Idea. And it was up until in that early part of 75, 76, the music scene around OCA was really nascent and wasn't well defined. It was kind of a glam queer culture. It was kind of amorphous, and for many of us, the concert that Gary put on that brought the Ramones to the New Yorker almost became like a gold vein that everybody kind of just grabbed onto, because here were four guys playing very basic material that it appeared as though anybody could just decide, I'm going to start a band. And so we combined what was going on with OCA, with the sound lab there, the video, the electronics, add in this sudden do-it-yourself, loud, aggressive, easy, I wouldn't say easy to play, but it just felt very empowering for a lot of people. And out of that concert, a lot of people picked up guitars. You know, we all had them as kids, but a lot of people picked up guitars or drums or whatever, and then eventually started playing regularly, you know, in little rehearsal studios. We essentially had the keys to the OCA experimental arts area, so we used to practice in the evening. The first concert was a band called the Eels, which opened for Oh Those Pants at OCA. That morphed into the Diodes just shortly thereafter. I joined the band at that point. And, but I don't want to underestimate the kind of the groundswell that was going on in and around Ontario College of Art, that it kind of became an enabler, yet this event at the New Yorker became a major catalyst for a lot of people. That's my understanding, that's sort of my historical understanding.
So is that
my own experience.
Were you guys consciously aware of punk rock? This is punk rock, or
As soon as we, yeah, I mean, it was, we were aware what was going on in New York, and the UK was just really starting to develop. It came a little later than that, but I mean, it was very broadly defined, right? I mean, it wasn't exactly only guys in leather jackets. I mean, you know, you contrast that with Talking Heads, contrast that with Blondie. I mean, it was a very wide range of musical tastes and influences, and so, I mean, in Toronto, you know, you've got the Poles, you've got the Viletones, right? Very, very different, you know, different spectrum of music there. So, but we chose kind of, I guess the Diodes chose this kind of middle path. We wanted the aggressive, loud music, but we wanted also to try to be, you know, clever, ironic, whatever, you know, that kind of thing. So, anyways, I've said enough for now. Thanks.
Well, no, I mean, carry on, but we'll, but that's a good segue in reference to the show that Gary put on at the New Yorker. Now, Gary, you were putting on music shows and film from, I guess, the early 70s, if not late 60s onward. And so when you were book a band like Ramones, was that like a punk rock band? Did you feel you were bringing the punk rock thing to Toronto, or is this they're just a band? Was the term even being used at that point in 1975? Was that when?
76.
76.
First of all, I told David a few days ago, I hate the title of this panel, Punk in Toronto. I think it's a really dumb title.
It wasn't my title.
No. But when you look at all the bands that were in Toronto at the time, from 76, say, to 1980, very few of them were punks. I think in New York, the three scenes, I think, were Toronto, New York, and London. And unfortunately, Toronto, I call the media the closet queens, because they didn't care about any of this stuff for years, not till like when the Edge closed in 1981, around the police picnic time, is when the media started thinking about it. But for, you know, there's a lot of people here I know who have been to a lot of the shows, all, you know. I made this list. Some of you will know all the bands. Very few were punk. And I'd like to read them, because I think, seeing that the title, the show, whatever this is called, the panel is punk. There were the B-Girls, the Cads, the Dents, the Diodes. The only band on this sheet that I never booked was the Diodes. But it was not because of the band, it was because of the singer. I just did not, I didn't relate. The Diodes, the Dishes, the Existers, the Government, the Mods, the Poles, the Scenics, the Swollen Members, the Ugly, the Viletones, 04, Tirana, True Confessions, Everglades, Raven Mojos, Nash the Slash, the Fits, Screamin' Sam, Androids, Robbie Rocks, Rough Trade, the Wads, Drastic Measures, the Government, the Secrets, Rent Boys, TBA, Hi-Fi's, who became Blue Rodeo, Bobcat, the Bobcats, Strike Naked and the Fletchos, Cardboard Brains, The Curse, Arson, Cross Kills 5, L'Étranger, Blue Peter, Martha and the Muffins, Johnny and the G-Rays, The Numbers, Tools, The Points, B.B. Gabor, The Fictions, The Sharks, The Basics, Popular Spies, The Biffs, Steve Blimke and The Reason, Chloe, I don't know, The Cubes, Hydraulic Chaos, Space Phlegm, Dead Bunnies, The Velours, Battered Wives, Daily Planet, The Time Twins, Spoons, Deserters, Rheostatics, Toby Swan, and The Sidewinders. Plus there was reggae that was coming out of, you know, more because of England. Reggae was becoming popular, Earth, Roots and Water, Aishan Band, Truth and Right, Chalawa. These were bands that we booked between the Horseshoe and the Edge from, as I say, 78 to 80. These are all local bands. Very few of them are what you think punk, like the Viletones or the Ugly. A lot of them were performance artists, I think, great performance artists. They were artistic. A lot of them, I had a movie theater called the original 99-cent Roxy that ran from 72 to late 75, and they moved to the and a lot of the, I call them kids because they were, and I was older, and Gary Cormier was older, came to the Roxy. Stephen Leckie used to come to the Roxy to see a classic French movie from the 40s called Children of Paradise. The B-Girls they weren't the B-Girls at the time, but in that period, the music was changing, you know, in New York especially. We're very connected to New York, we're very connected to England, and you know, everybody was reading about all this stuff. The first time I heard the word punk was actually Suicide, well before the Ramones. So it's a shitty name for a panel.
Well, sorry to drag you out on a cold night.
It's lucky I found a parking spot. No, at the Roxy, you know, I was playing like the Stooges and the Velvet Underground. When I was at Centennial College, I started a film society there, which kind of was what I wanted to do when I got out of school, because I didn't want to be like everybody else. And I was kind of bored with school and culture and the city. It was very Protestant orange, and I had this film society, and I ran the Chelsea Girls 3-hour Andy Warhol movie on like 16 different reels or whatever number. And it was packed. It was kind of a notorious movie, and just as we were about to turn the lights off, what they called the morality squad, the police came in and wouldn't allow us to show the movie, and confiscated the movie. I had rented it from the Museum of Modern Art, and we found a way of showing it later on. But I remember, and this is in like the late 60s, and I had a stool. I don't know if any of you know Wayne Scott. Wayne Scott was a bicycle advocate. He was an advocate for bicycle couriers being union members, and an advocate for bike lanes and everything. He's dead now. He and I set up a little record player in front of the screen on a stool, and we're playing Velvet Underground, the first album and stuff. So that kind of music was in my blood. I knew about it. I knew what was going on because from like 1960 I had a subscription to the Village Voice. So I knew everything that was going on. And back to your question, when we were at the New Yorker, I had, for 5 years I had been running 2 different movies every night, all-night shows, 24-hour shows, trying to keep it interesting and not mainstream. And one night we were screening a movie called Blank Generation by Amos Poe, which was a 35-minute movie, home movies of all the bands that were sprouting up in New York, CBGBs and Maxes and all that. And I was showing it that one night, one screening, and kind of really tired of showing some, it's hard to show all these movies. It wasn't digital, it was all film, and there's only so much available, we being in Canada. And I'm thinking I should build a stage. So my hillbilly brother-in-law and his friends came down from Huntsville, and they built this concrete stage in front of the screen at the New Yorker. And the building inspector actually said, you only needed to do it in wood. This is like a fallout shelter. You could put an elephant on this thing. You guys couldn't do Aida or something. But so then I went to this mainstream music agent, David Bluestein. He had a group called an agency called the Agency, and I was friends with him, and said, okay, I've got this stage now. Where do I put all the power outlets and all that stuff? What do I need? So he told me to do all that. We did all that, and he said, who do you want? I said, Ramones. You ever heard of them? No. And he said, I'll look for them. And he called me back like 5 days later. He said, I found them for you. I wanted to do 3 shows. That's like a 500 a show. Do Friday night, a Saturday night, and a Saturday midnight. They want, $5,000 for the 3 shows. Which was pretty good, actually, but not really for a pocketbook. But 1,000 people came. But I didn't think of it as punk. I just thought of it as a band, and I've never thought of any of these bands, the Wild Tones, of the sort of punk band. I never thought of them as bands. I came out of, I was a music fan from literally like 3 years old. I knew Rodgers and Hammerstein backwards and forwards, you know, when I was in grade 1. And it was strange because, am I talking too much?
No, that's great. I mean, that's fascinating.
Okay, so-
I forgot I was even supposed to be moderating. I was listening to the story, Gary. That's great.
We're allowed to fall asleep, right? A few weeks ago, like the book that UXB Press put out called He Hijacked My Brain, which is basically, you know, it centers around me. It's an oral history of what you're all here to hear about. It's not about me, it's about this group of, you know, literally about 1,000 people who were in bands and came to shows, and how they basically, I think, in every city, maybe everywhere, but changed Toronto and everywhere in the world. But we were getting an award for the book, the Heritage Toronto Award, and it was at the Carlew, which was Eden's Auditorium when I was a kid. It was a theater that Lady Eden had built in the 40s to bring culture to Toronto. And, you know, we won. There were like about 23 other books in the running, and we won. And we had to give a speech. And what I found interesting was that, and I said this, because I don't know what to say, but in 1952, and I researched it to make sure, my parents took me to Eden's Auditorium to see Peter Pan, you know, flanking. And it was probably the first, I would have been 7. I'm going to be 80 in a couple of weeks. It was like the first live theater, other than like in a school auditorium, that I had ever seen. There was music, and it just sort of, this is what I was fascinated with and wanted to do all my life. And you know, that's how I got the buzz. But you know, I was interested in music, all kinds of music. When I first started hearing all the bands in New York, it reminded me of the 60s, listening to the free jazz scene that was happening. Albert Eiler, you know, John Coltrane, Cecil Taylor, Summer, all this stuff. That's what really hit me about what was going on, and not so much in England, because it was really punk rock and political and all that. But I just started. I wanted to bring these groups. These groups were to rock music what jazz was to Stan Getz, maybe, you know? Not that I have anything against Stan Getz, but you know what I mean? Like, it was new music, and I hate the term, but it was literally new music. You never heard anything like this before. And you know, television, and Suicide, like, actually one of my favorite shows of all time was Suicide at the Horseshoe, with a riot, thanks to teenage head fans who didn't like them. So anyway,
It wasn't a nut joke.
Well, anyway, I just want to say, but all these groups, this variety of music that sprouted in Toronto, these kids, again, were interested in other music, not like today or any other generation. And so when we did the Ramones at the New Yorker, 2 weeks later, we did a North Indian version of Ravi Shankar, Ali Akbar Khan, at the New Yorker. I had seen him in the 60s at Eden's Auditorium. When I saw that he was available, we got to book him. And there were a lot of leather jackets who came to see this stuff. You know, I don't think that generation will ever happen again because of technology and media and stupidity and whatever. You know, it was a major. Hold on, yeah.
The punk scene ignited the art scene. And then the Cameron started. And the Cameron became a community center for all the different mediums. The painters, the photographers, everybody met there. And so the music was playing, and it was growing, and the art scene started to change, and it grew together.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, exactly. Like when the punk scene started, as David said, it was the DIY, do-it-yourself thing. I can pick up a guitar and play. Well, I'm a good cook. I'm going to open up a restaurant. I love art. I'm going to open up, you know, an art gallery, etc., etc. And you know, you guys all go to all over the city, I'm sure. You wouldn't have stepped foot in Parkdale back then. The art scene, I'll just call it the art scene, that developed from this scene of this generation of kids who did what they wanted. They wanted to counter the culture. They changed everything. And it took years for the media to catch up on it. And I think that generation, and I'm glad to have been part of it, you know, sort of in the middle of it. And what we did was try to, when we saw somebody we liked, we booked them and we nurtured them and we tried to get press for them and built them and I mean, you know, that's what parents are for.
Well, I think what we're hearing here from you, Gary, and Ian, is that you know, punk came out of a context. It's interesting that if you know, Toronto and London were the two of the first cities with punk, they're also two of the first cities with reggae as well. And also the Clash went to ICA, London, and that's where some of their first shows were. And of course they picked up on the reggae, incorporated reggae into their music early on, right? So
Well, I think New York came before England.
It did.
yeah. No, that's
Not
yeah.
by much, though. But,
No.
Well, I think it was because, again, the Ramones were coming to Toronto, they were going to London, they were from New York, and that was, you know, part of the circuit that they were on. But this idea that there's a clash between art and music, and also, like I said, specifically reggae becoming part of that, it is interesting what you say, because sometimes I feel, you know, music scenes now are so siloed. You wouldn't necessarily, even you know, I know a lot of my friends and people I know that cannot accommodate the Ramones and Ravi Shankar. It's got, you know, it's one or the other of those. That's or you know, the Ramones and Sun Ra. That's a big stretch for some people. Sorry.
I just wanted to interject something, if I may.
That's why you're here.
I think there was a real emphasis in 75, 76, this idea that you could span media as an individual creator. You could run across fashion, you could publish your own zine, you could pick up a guitar, you could we couldn't make our own records yet, we didn't have the technology, but it was very much, as Gary even put up, you could open a restaurant. I mean, there was something about that particular period and the cross-fertilization that was going on among so many people in that general area that led to this really just an explosion of creative output. You know, the crash and burn, which lived 3 months or less, came directly out of that, and in the middle of it was a fashion show that David Buchan put on. And it was a really great fashion show. But of course, that was part of the whole ethos, right? It was dress, it was publishing, it was making music, it was making art. And I think because of that, you know, we didn't have the internet, so
You had to do something.
had to make do, right?
Well, since it mentioned a punk ethos, Liz, do you feel that there is such a thing as a punk ethos? If so, can you define that or talk about it through the people that you've spoken to that were there?
Yeah, I don't know. I think a lot of these things happen in hindsight. And a lot of the people who I interviewed for Treat Me Like Dirt talked about that at the time they said that, I don't want to speak for you, but that there wasn't this sense of it being a scene or a movement yet, that came with looking back. And I think that is probably true for every decade. I think what punk has done is that it started something that began as counterculture, it began as underground, but then it actually took hold into the mainstream in a lot of ways that we have stopped noticing. So when you're talking about an explosion in media, for example, the peak of magazine publishing was in the 90s. Right now we're in this digital period, and yes, it feels weird, but there are actually a lot of younger people under 30 who are creating at the same levels that people were in 77, and things are happening again where there is more crossover at shows as well, where there's less categorization. A punk show can mean many different sounds and many styles again. These things are still happening, but I think that what has happened is that punk has actually become so ingrained in so many aspects of our culture. It's almost like it infiltrated fashion and sound and mindset. And so people now are still taking reference from what happened within that first wave, and they keep replicating it. And we see it in so many ways. Zine culture is a big part of punk, even though it didn't necessarily start there, but zines are still happening. The way people dressed in the 70s and 80s through punk fashion is stuff that you can buy at H&M now. It's, all of these things are everywhere. And so I don't know if it's so much about punk ethos. I think it's more that punk opened something up for people and showed them that they could create in different ways, and that they could also have a different path in life, because there are also a lot of people who came out of the punk scene, like Ian, who were coming out of art school. And at the time, it wasn't popular to go to art school. Now art schools have far more applicants than they can handle. But throughout the 70s and 80s, nobody wanted to go to art school.
I went to art school.
Okay, yeah, so I'm just saying though, it wasn't seen as a viable career. What changed
Sounds like
that
I mixed up in
was,
punk.
it's music, it's culture, it's punk that started to change that, because people started to take influence from what they were seeing that first wave doing. And so I think that's more, when we talk about the ethos, it's hard to define because it's actually everywhere, and sometimes I think people are taking reference or inspiration from it without even noticing.
Well, and then, punk continued to evolve. Sorry, Gary, we're sticking a little bit to the horrible topic at hand here, but at any point, please, pipe in. But, of course, some people think punk's not dead, and then other people think it was dead and over by 1980.
Even sooner in some respects.
And sooner in some respects, and in some ways, maybe as soon as something gets labeled, as humans like to do, we like to put a label on it and pin it down and study it. But maybe as soon as something becomes static, well, stasis is death. But of course, punk still continues. Certainly, I see as in music. And then there was kind of a big wave of a second wave of punk. The Southern California sound. In Toronto, you had a bunch of fucking goofs, which, are major, in an underground way. I was in Montreal, I felt they were major. But that continued along, I think a lot of it with the DIY approach, as we're all agreeing here, but it also came with some of the aesthetics around it too, the type of music being loud, fast, a bit obnoxious, in some cases kind of political, and some of the fashion around that, as much as you can see the fashion influence on the runways and in H&M, there's still hardcore punks out there today that are rocking that in in a way that I think some of those people feel like is adhering to, you know, the original spirit. So
Yeah, more of the British influence, I think, in that case. You know, there is the hardcore punk that continued to go kind of right, but I think Gary's original premise of this very wide variety of musical output is probably more accurate for Toronto, that there really was incredible diversity. Now, many bands decided to pick up styles and references from earlier music eras. Take, for example, you know, the Mods, or even Blue Rodeo, for example. I mean, country went through a major kind of retrofit or resurgence on Queen Street West in the early 80s. And so that
Well,
was,
Handsome
there was
Ned,
this
he was
sort of
embraced by the folk scene.
self-consciously picking up musical influences, as opposed to what I think in the 60s kind of represented a continuation or an evolution up until the point where, you know, we had, you know, progressive rock, very sophisticated music. This, much of what this do-it-yourself stuff did is it kind of reached back into musical history, popular musical history, and took out what they felt suited them for their particular genre or style of music they wanted to pursue.
Like at the Edge, we brought a rockabilly group, Teddy Boy group, called Crazy Kevin and the Rhythm Rockers. They brought a busload of Teddy Boys with them to holiday with them in Toronto for a weekend. And what happened there was, you know, especially like Stephen Leckie was there. When that was over, he was no longer a punk. He was no longer a punk. He changed his whole persona. And I think Toronto, the Toronto fans were very open to all sorts of music, and incorporated the music in their music and in their performances. And, you know, as Liz said, it was all about fashion, or Ian, I don't know, all about fashion, totally about fashion. There was no media except independent media like Smash It Up and The Nerve and Pig Paper and all these journalists, young journalists who I think they influenced what are now like podcasts, and I don't know what I was going to say or why I'm saying it.
Well, I mean, I think we're continuing on this theme that, you know, punk evolved in the context, and maybe, I don't know if that's true, but, you know, there was an open-mindedness to it. There was maybe even community associated with that a little bit. Can we go as far as to call it a community?
Absolutely.
I just want to acknowledge one thing here, slightly off topic, Gary, but I just, you know, take this opportunity to thank you, because I remember when you brought William S. Burroughs to the Edge. What a show that was. Well, it was a reading. It was a William S. Burroughs reading, and there seemed to be a lot of that punk, alternative, or whatever. It was the same crowd that, you know, were, you know, going to see the Head or the Rebels at, you know, at the Edge the previous night or week.
Well, this, the crowd, I mean, they came to the Roxy and they watched Jean-Luc Godard movies and Roger Corman movies on the same night. And they were cultured. They weren't punks like Sal Mineo. They were cultured. They were a very cultured group of people, and hence, you know, the music that they produced, and also the way they promoted themselves. Nobody promotes themselves like they did. You don't find that now. You know, it's all Live Nation or whatever. These kids were all on their own. You know, there were a few clubs where they could play, and like, it was fabulous. It was just a fabulous, interesting bunch of people. They weren't punks. You know, they might have been punks and shaking up the system or whatever, but they, you know, I think the Ramones, you know, with the way they dressed and all that, get their identity as punk, but they weren't really punks.
Well, I know in
They were creators.
some of the shows we did in Hamilton, you know, Hamilton at that time was more of a biker culture than punks, and you know, the bikers weren't actually that keen when the punks started showing up from Toronto. So there was even a little bit of tension there in the air, and that, you know, that clash of cultures, which was kind of you know, explosive in a way. But I feel like then, as you know, when Liz was interviewing me for a book some number of years ago, and asked me, so how do I want to be, you know, classified in the book? I just said, a fan. I was just a fan of the music. But I feel like also the audience back then was part of it. In a way, the delineation between performer and audience, because a lot of the audiences used to were also in bands, and you know, you're playing in small dive bars and whatnot, so everybody's kind of all in the room at once. And you know, I know, you know, specifically with Teenage Head, they just felt like they were part, and they were the same as everybody else. They were just the guys that you know, that had the instruments on stage. So there was, I think, not only crossover between genres, I think there was also a crossover between audience and performer. Also, you're talking about fashion shows, poetry readings, this kind of a thing. So I think this was maybe before things got a little bit, let's say, siloed. Is that fair to say, Liz? What's your take on that?
I mean, I think, you know, I do agree that things do become siloed. As you said, people like to put labels on everything. I think that that's unfortunately, you know, this natural inclination that people have, and sometimes people really want the, you know, the either or option, right? Everything becomes a binary of this or that, and I think that. I think that punk's proximity, when we're talking about the first wave, has also something to do with the proximity to Andy Warhol, and because Andy Warhol was also doing all of these things. He was doing art, he was making film, he was involved in performance, he was involved in Velvet Underground.
He was the manager.
Right, and he had this whole, you know, this whole hub where all of these different art practices were centering around him, and he was pushing out so many ideas, but he didn't just represent one thing. He did many things, and he became known for all of those things. And to have somebody like that at such a level of influence at a time when media had such a trickle-down culture, in a way that it doesn't have anymore, because so many of our communications have become flattened, and we are spending so much different time putting our attention into different sources of information. But at that time, if mainstream media was talking about someone like Andy Warhol, then a lot of people would have awareness about someone like Andy Warhol, and that would also be planting seeds around, what could I do? Could I also have a band, as well as be an artist, as well as be putting on weird performance art? Maybe I could. But now we're many, many years out from Andy Warhol, and punk is coming up to its 50th anniversary as well. I know. And so you know, the more time passes, the more we lose that type of context, and we lose that collective memory of having that kind of proximity.
Well, you mentioned Andy Warhol. Now it's interesting because I think Malcolm McLaren in London, in Britain, played a similar role. I mean, essentially, the Sex Pistols were an art project. They were Malcolm McLaren's art project after he had some disaster managing the New York Dolls. right? And so he put that together, and of course that took place at a fashion shop, right? So it was, you know, involved in fashion right from the beginning.
And then there's the Mercer Arts Center in New York City, the Woody Vilsuka, the Video Center. There was, I mean, that's where the New York Dolls got their start.
Yeah.
Right, they played there pretty much every Friday. You'd see Laurie Anderson rubbing shoulders with the New York Dolls on the same night. I mean, it was
Patti Smith, Robert Mapplethorpe, they were all there. Yeah.
They were all there, right? So unfortunately, it burned down, but and then that actually was one of the things that probably got CBGB's really moving. We all went down to see television. OCAD or OCA had these school trips down to New York City, and we spent a lot of time at CBGB's when we were down there. And when we saw television, it just blew us away. We were really, really impressed with the performance down there. So, you know, New York really was an inspiration for a lot of young third-year students, you know, who wanted to do something.
Well, speaking of, you know, the breakdown between performer and audience, I see we've got a couple of questions happening over here. Yeah, where are you going like that? You're putting your hand up.
The Mercer Arts Center, that was the building that collapsed into the street, was it? Or was it the one you said it burned down with?
It burned down in like '73.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just reading about it, part of the studying up for this particular, reminding myself, right, of what was going on.
Oh, this isn't just all coming off the top of your head. You've been doing your homework here, right? That's good. You're taking it seriously. Yeah, sorry. Were you still going there? Or what?
I just wanted to, I read that when you guys took the trip down to New York City, the CBGB said, Steve Leckie was disappointed in how some of the bands, their attitude was shaped compared to some of the guys and other bands back home. Is this true, or is this kind of just snowballed, like, you know?
Well, I can't speak for Stephen Leckie in this particular case, other than the fact that there were, I guess it was 5 bands went down. I think it was Teenage Head and Valtones took the lead on it, and the Curse, the Big Girls, and the Diodes somehow got on the same bill with the Cramps, and I'm not sure how that happened. I wasn't part of that particular thing, but in any event, it was a very long night, basically all night, but I don't recall Stephen being disappointed, but don't quote me on that, I guess.
We actually, he came to the Edge one night and needed money to go to New York. And we did give him money to get there, and he did actually pay us back.
It's important to know. He was that kind of guy. Yes. So a question there? Yeah.
Well, it seems to me that you got no support in terms of getting your airplane in Toronto. But could you talk about trying to get on the airwaves? Because I don't remember hearing any of these bands on the alternate radio stations.
So we got on Chum FM live from the Elmo Combo in early '78. That was really the only thing that they did, and I think that was the arm wrestling of the record company to promote our first album. It wasn't really until CFNY became a real force that we got part of regular rotation. Now in Chicago and other locations, we were on underground regular rotation, LA, but never really broke anything on the radio in New York and in Toronto. It was tough. It was really tough.
I had a radio show on Q107, 1980. 1 till 2 in the morning, Saturday, Sunday mornings. I would leave the Edge and go and do this show for an hour called The Edge of Morning. And I played my music. And you have no idea the response I got. We had bomb threats. We had at least 3 bomb threats. And people hated us. You know, I didn't really hook into Led Zeppelin for many years. And that's all they wanted to hear. But, you know, when I would walk home, I lived on Charles Street, just south of Q107. I feared for my life. They really hated what I did. But everybody got airplay.
Well, it's interesting, the scene was so explosive here in Toronto, yet so, I guess the mainstream, so resistant to it. Right, in a lot of ways. I don't know who already mentioned that earlier, but I think, you know, punk or, you know, a lot of that alternative sound coming out in other cities then got accepted in New York, London, Chicago, and LA before it was here. And meanwhile, this was one of the biggest scenes there was. You know, so in Toronto, sometimes I feel it's a little bit, you know, behind on recognizing its own self and its own contributions to culture. I know we're busy building condos and that. Sorry, was there another, yeah? Huh?
I just wanted to say, I think someone was talking about the how it spread out into the community outside of the music itself. And I do know, I mean, no one's talked about doing the pogo, you know, and you go to the band, you go to like any of the punk clubs and everyone's jumping up and down, up and down. And I think there was a real feeling to just release yourself during the punk scene. And I had learned punk when I was touring other theater in New York and Paris and all through Europe, and there were always little scenes, but most of it was about just getting done with work, drinking some beer, smoking some joints, doing some coke, and jumping and going crazy. And that was a real important thing to do back then. We had a theater, we started the theater center, and it was like there was the first gay theater, first feminist theater, all of this going on. But it was the same period of time. And when I came back and I met Murray Schaefer, and he said, well, what do you do? I said, well, I'm into kind of like, you know, whatever, the punk scene and that. He said, good, okay, you're going to direct my next show. So we directed a huge opera at the Science Center. And I think that blended over because that world or that ethos just gave you permission to do whatever the fuck you wanted to do. And that was, and you know, 3-chord change with maybe a minor 7th thrown in, you can pretty much do anything. So I think that it's important that end. And when we did Sid's Kids, and I don't know whoever saw that, but a lot of people didn't like it, but it was a punk musical we did. And we had auditions down on the big church on Avenue Road, just north of Bloor, and we had lineups. People were dying to get up on the stage and sing and play a 3-chord change and do whatever. We finally did it at Mike Gallo's The Voodoo Club. And that was a whole new romantic era that was coming into play. And then Montreal was coming in with all the fashion anyway.
Yeah, well, it's funny you say the pogo, because I guess if, you know, the kids, you know, needed to let off some steam, you know, had to go down to the club, get together with other like-minded people. I guess now you can just sit at home and rage post. Sorry, yeah.
So, I wanted to say that an interesting thing that's been touched upon here is like the connection of art colleges or art departments of universities around the world, like OCA here. An important thing is like Roy Ascot, who came here to OCA and created the Great Disruption in like 1968-69, and created the situation that the Diodes were part of, and Gary eventually became part of, right? This situation where someone that got from England came here, Roy Ascot was a major influence on the Who when they became pop art visually. Never mind the music, just the visual aspect of them. Roy Ascot was a big part of that, and he turned the OCA upside down, which is the point when I became affiliated with OCA. Late 1969, when I was a high schooler, was drew me into that scene. And Gary, I recognize you from back then, and Roxy. There's a big scene. There's like connection between art colleges and music, as existed in England and in New York and here. Part of my problem with the punk rock scene is this. I think there's a thing called New York New Wave, and then there's a punk rock thing. I don't think they're the same thing. I don't think that Patti Smith and television are punk rock. I think they're New York New Wave. This other punk rock scene is something else. You can argue if you want.
Well, and so, well, that's why I asked earlier about Liz, because I know some people want to really, keep these things defined, and to some extent I respect that, because it's, let's say, it's a certain style of music. But I've also heard two people say that, punk is an attitude.
Yeah.
Maybe punk is an attitude
Yeah.
as much as let's say, a musical genre. So I think, some of those at Patti Smith and television weren't exactly, playing punk rock like the Ramones or the Pistols, but I think the attitude was the same, and as I think we keep hearing here, and even, from the audience, there was something going on back in this era that really created a fantastic explosion of art and culture, music, and punk rock. I guess this is my take on it. Is that the punk rock came up in a context. It was not an isolated phenomenon of dudes in leather jackets, right?
Yep.
So I think it was all what do you want to call it? Maybe it doesn't even matter. Gary doesn't think it matters, right? He doesn't even like the title.
But I think those examples, television and Patti Smith, those are also really great examples of how punk was never just one thing. Because Patti Smith, yes, she's an amazing singer, but she's also an incredible writer, and poetry was really important to her, and television as well. Members of television were in film. They wrote poetry too. They were not just a band, and we don't always see that as much now, where people just go really hard into one area of creativity. There's a lot more expansion at that time, but David, you keep talking about context, and I think that, when someone mentioned media earlier, and media is a really important aspect of this too, because it wasn't only airplay that was hard to get, it was the support from mainstream media, and it wasn't that people weren't talking about punk in Toronto. People were talking about it, but they weren't talking about it as a way to document it, which is an issue in Canada. We don't document our artists, we don't care about our history. What people were talking about instead in the Toronto Star or CBC was, oh, you have a dog collar, that's weird, right? And there was a point where, where dog collars as fashion were banned from sale in Toronto. This is the thing that people cared about at the time, and this is part of the issue as to why this history is so hidden. But it's also a reflection of why it's so hard now to see what might be considered avant-garde today rise back up into mainstream conversation. Because it was a lot easier then to shock people, and the media in Canada was very conservative when it came to those cultural discussions. So you could have somebody like William S. Burroughs really appeal to counterculture because his books were considered quite shocking at the time. These days, nobody cares. Nobody talks about William S. Burroughs except for the punk rock people who know him, right? But nobody cares anymore. It's very hard, and trust me, I try to be avant-garde. It's impossible to get anybody to care. It's very hard as an artist these days to have that level of reaction to your work or to what you're doing, and I think that punk emerged from that context as well, where if you were walking down the street and you had a spiked collar or colored hair, or you had a band like the Vile Tones or the Diodes, people thought, this isn't like anything else. We have to react to it, and the reaction has to be negative. And so it was a lot easier, I think, for people creating art at that time to work within that reaction.
We care.
To your comments, I think in that era, the music, aside from anything else, was considered art by those who were open enough to be interested or understand it or whatever. And at the Edge, for instance, in 1980, nobody stood up. Everybody watched. And I remember one night the band X were playing there. And I used to like doing the lights. And the sound guy was their sound guy, and he, come do the lights. He gets up from the soundboard and he runs in front of the stage and he's pogoing up and down. And everybody is watching him like, what the fuck? Like they were like light years behind as far as what punk was or how it was interpreted. And
Well, it wasn't like that in Hamilton. It wasn't like that in Hamilton. The audience there, I mean, things were, bordered, especially the punk shows, were bordering on violent. But anyway.
Did happen, yeah. I guess the point I want to make about this idea of do-it-yourself culture, this idea, I mean, let's call it amateurism, that anybody could kind of go, just go. Don't think that you need to go and spend 8 months at the conservatory before you can even play in front of somebody. Just go. So that led to this sort of incredible velocity from about 1976 in Toronto through, say, the end of 78, 79, where there seemed to be no fear, right? Let's just do it and go. And if we don't do it right the first time, we'll do it right the second or third or fourth or fifth time. And all of these bands just got better and better and better and better over time. The record contracts appeared. And this is part of, I think, what created the barrier to entry seemed really low because everybody was in the same boat in a sense, right? We were all just kind of starting out. And that's what I remember more than anything else about that particular time.
Well, I think it's, at that point, maybe it was more of a way of life. These days we hear about, artistic practice. Things have become very, very professionalized now. And, you don't want to, bands are starting out, you don't want to start, pissing off potential, record labels or, making trouble like that. And I think back then, again, from my feeling back then, there was no hope that the mainstream was going to pay attention to you anyways. So there was nothing at stake.
Correct. Yeah.
So maybe that's, these days for music and art, people can make a viable living if you, if you're professional and behave properly. There are opportunities now, I think.
Behave properly and punk just do not go together.
Sorry?
I said behave properly and punk are not together.
And making a living.
Yeah. Is there any other questions out there? Yeah.
So I'm looking at technology and the impact on music as you...
Can you speak a little louder? Sorry.
I'm looking at technology and impact on music, and you've probably seen some music that was already created by AI. And AI is a big word now. But I have a strong suspicion you might be the last generation who will enjoy real arts. What do you think about that?
That's terrifying.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
trying to instill a little different ethic in my kids.
I don't think anything replaces live music, so. my opinion. That being said, I'm guilty of tinkering and looking at the edges of, technology all the time, but something about the real person. But I understand that there are AI artists only on the top Billboard charts right now, so it's actually happening.
Yeah, I think there is. It's an interesting question. I haven't thought about it in terms of generation. But there are people, I'm not saying it's anyone in this room, they're obviously all outside of this room, but I think there are people who see music really as background music.
Right.
They don't care who's making it, they're not interested in the artist, they don't think about the process behind it, don't appreciate the process. To them, it's like, it sounds cool, I'm driving in my car, I need something to listen to, and that's all it is. And I think that that's how a lot of people actually interact with music, unfortunately. But I also think that we are at the end of a golden age of many things in human culture, and art is one of them. We look at the beginning of rock and roll in the 50s, up until, say, the end of the 90s, we had an explosion of all of these different genres, different facets of culture that have all fit together. We've had all of these youth movements like punk emerge. And a lot of them have become historically important for many generations, right? There are a lot of us in this room who are of different ages, and we can all really connect to those different eras. And I don't know what comes after that. Once the last generations of those artists die off, and they're no longer active, because a lot of them are still active, but once that stops, I don't know what comes after that.
Well, I think in a way, what you're describing is maybe similar to the feeling that some people had back then, that the mainstream wasn't paying attention to them. There was nothing for them. The 60s had already happened. It was all over. There was nothing left to do. But I think that's when the kids or, people that, have to make art will do that anyways. And so maybe there's a point now, and there's some bands out there now that are in punk, and others that are they're out there, they're troublemakers, but of course you can you would watch them all flying by on IG. You don't even I think a lot of it had to do with people. If you wanted to share ideas and make something happen, you had to be with other people. You had to gather somewhere, whether it's a dive bar or a proper venue. You had to do that. So maybe the shift now is you can there's other ways to make trouble, maybe in a way that's. But there's so many tools and so many aspects of professionalism going on now. I guess it seems a little more fractured than it is together. But anyways, so we could be wrapping up now. I apologize, people standing here. So all the people that are here, this is half the number of people that responded to this panel discussion. So I think it's interesting. Maybe there's another opportunity for another talk on this really rich topic of, let's say, the Toronto cultural scene in the late 70s, early 80s.
You got a new title.
Yeah, so that's where we're floating the title for the next talk. But so I apologize for people standing, but we'll take a couple more questions. I know we're running past the time here. Is there anybody else that wants to say something really crucial here, a mic drop moment out there? Okay, well that's great. So thank you very much to the panelists here.